Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us for our talk on Flint Awls today from the British Mesolithic. And we'll talk to you a little bit about some experimental work and some microwear and SEM work that I've been doing, specifically focusing on breakage of tools. So the basic question we're trying to ask here is, why do tools break? But we're asking that in a very particular way around early British Mesolithic personal ornament production and flint tool use. In this case, awls, and quite why they might snap in use. So we've done some previous work on this, looking at two key sites, Star Carr and Nab Head from Britain. And these are interesting sites because we have shale personal ornaments, which were only really found in Britain during the early Mesolithic, and flint awls in abundance at both locations. However, they're of a different size, larger at Star Carr, smaller at Nab Head, and we're interested to understand why we're seeing this elevated pattern of snapping in this particular tool type at these sites where we have personal ornament production. So we're trying to think that through. Higher snap rates, is this taphonomy? Is it use? Or is it something else? And this is really where we've started our research from. So just to give you a little bit more background about the sites then, we have Nab Head I in Wales, and this is right on the coast at St. Bride's Bay. A little under 700 shale beads here, and around 50 mesh deforés available for study at the Cardiff Museum, which was the sample that we used. Many of those found by Andrew David in his 1979 to 1980 excavation, which has good stratigraphic control. However, the tools are not necessarily well preserved from the point of view of microwear analysis, so we're limited in the extent to which we can do work of that nature. The tools are also much smaller, and it's been suggested that this small size encourages their use in something like a bow drill for drilling action or drilling activity. They're likely smaller because the raw material available on the coast is small, pebble-like material, which maybe is an influence about why the tools start off smaller. Star Carr is in England, in Yorkshire, a little earlier in date, so right at the very start of the early Mesolithic. And we have the advantage at Star Carr of really good organic preservation and really good preservation in general. That's declined in recent decades because of site drainage, unfortunately. But across excavations by Clark in the 1940s, through work in the 80s, and now from 2005 to 15, we found 183 awls, so really big assemblage of awls, and around 30 shale beads. So you have that relationship again between a large number of awls and a large number of shale beads that we're really interested in. The larger size maybe doesn't necessitate the use of a bow drill. So that's an interesting question we've had in the background. So our previous work has been trying to test exactly how people drill and how that affects things like wear patterns. And Jess has done amazing work on the microwear for this. But mostly our focus has been trying to understand what awls are used for, really. Is it a unique tool used for a unique action for drilling of shale and other personal ornaments, or is it a wider ranging craft tool?
Yeah, so in our paper that we published last year, we put forward the idea that flint awls at Star Carr were used on a range of contact materials, so not just shale beads, which we might presume from the material record, but actually for things like wood, bone, hide, and then also mineral. So they're a multi-purpose crafting tool. And we wanted to take this further a little bit with, as Andy was saying, we mentioned this idea of tool snapping. And we noticed that a lot of these awls, or a high number of these awls, were snapped. And this started to raise some new questions that we wanted to tackle. So 12 examples show severe tip snapping at Star Carr. And that's, by severe, we're talking about the image on the left of your screens. So quite a truncated snap towards the distal end of the awl. Previous experimental work that we've done in using awls on different materials didn't create this breakage or this severe type of breakage. And so we wanted to look into it a bit further. I've had a look at some of the awls under a microscope, and there's no evidence of use around the broken snap. So we don't think it's related to sort of breaking because they're trying to create a new tool, perhaps. So then we thought that it could be potentially decommissioning. So they're intentionally trying to break the tool, perhaps for some kind of symbolic sort of rationale. And I think it's important to note here that these macroscopic observations from Nab Head and Clark's Star Carr all assemblage also show a pattern where we're seeing severe types of snapping on the awls. So it's not something that's unique to Star Carr. And so for these reasons, we really wanted to do some more experimental work to look into this pattern and understand why it might be occurring across these sites.
So we had three hypotheses that we wanted to try and test, really, having looked at this pattern together, starting with work at Star Carr, then extending our work into Nab Head, thinking primarily about, as we've said, sort of personal alimentation and the relationship with tools and how that might blend together into a particular craft set and craft activity. Really starting to look at the overall snap pattern and this elevated rate of snap. And we can see now that they're not uniquely used on a particular contact material. They might not be used in only a particular way in terms of how they have to use. So we really need to do some more testing to understand this. So we have three hypotheses that we think are logical in this area, really. One is unintentional, and it's possibly a natural taphonomic action, whether some sort of human taphonomic agency or a natural factor that might account for this high rate of snapping, say trampling or something of that nature. The other might be caused by use. So how you haft the tool, what you're drilling, the forces involved in trying to do that might cause unintended snapping of the tool just through use and attrition. The third possibility is that neither of those other two possibilities account for the whole pattern, at which point something wibbly wobbly and interesting might be happening. So something perhaps intentional or caused by non-functional anthropogenic activity. So what Jess has alluded to is maybe intentional snapping or decommission of the tool. So we started to look at all three of these, and we think we can probably dismiss hypothesis one before we move into the experimentation phase. Having looked at the site reports for Nab Head and for Star Carr, there's nothing compelling about the depositional environment in either case that accounts for that snapping pattern, not least because there's no obvious elevated snapping for all tool types that we can see in either of those. This is something we can't really fully dismiss, and we'll keep always as an active component as our analysis unfolds further in the future. But we think for now, we can dismiss hypothesis one, and nothing from the wider literature necessarily gives us a clue about what type of taphonomic agent could account for this pattern. So our work that we present to you today is mostly about hypothesis two, unintentional snapping caused by use, and hypothesis three, intentional snapping caused by some sort of anthropogenic action, such as decommissioning, for example. So the methods we've used then, we've broadly got two phases of work here, drilling in the first instance and then snapping. The drilling, we have a range of contact materials, and this is mostly working out from Star Carr and from the results we generated with the microwear work there. So we take in wood, shale, bone, antler, and leather, and we try to drill in three different configurations. A bow drill, what we call hand drilling, so almost like a fire drill method. And you can see that in the middle image on the top row there. The bow drill you can see in the top right. And that's very much, you just turn a bow in a different orientation and use it essentially like a powered drill. And then what we call a freehand method, which is the bottom right image there. In terms of the method of hafting, we haven't used any adhesive. We've used bat to put the tool into a wooden haft and then just tie it, and that holds it in place. Partly this is because we don't think it's strictly necessary to have to actually it holds perfectly well without it. It also would mask any microwear traces potentially. And obviously we're interested in that from the point of view of our experiment. So we went ahead without any glue for the purpose of the experiment. It might be interesting to try some of that in future perhaps. We've also tried it with Star Carr type awls and then Nab Head type awls, so long and short awls respectively, and repeated all of our experiments with that. And then for snapping, we're at an earlier stage with our snapping experiment, but we tried snapping these by hand and then using a hammerstone to compare the results. In all cases, we run with our experimental observations, so we can provide sort of qualitative observational insight, but also we back that up with a higher powered technique. So with the drilling, we're primarily using microwear for that, and for the snapping, we're primarily using SEM, and then using those different techniques to back up our initial observations. So in terms of results then, for hypothesis two, which is hafted, linked to functional work, the only type of real clear pattern of snapping that we saw was with the bow drill, and especially when we're working with dry wood, likely because the wood is so fibrous, this grips onto the tool. As you have that downwards force and rotational force, the tool bites into the wood and it forces a snap, where there's no wiggle for the tool really. Where the tool is curved along its long axis, so in that bottom image that you can see there, this increases the likelihood that tool will snap. So in the case of wood, we had a couple that were curved and they snapped really quite quickly. No other pattern of snapping really presented itself, whether by bore drill on other materials, whether by other types of drilling method. So your freehand method in particular caused no breakage whatsoever.
And so from a microwear perspective, we were really interested to see whether these awls that were snapping had some kind of associated wear on them. And really interestingly, even after 1 minute and 44 seconds of using the one of the awls in a bow drill to drill dry wood, we saw there were some faint developed traces of hafting that were beginning to develop on the edge of snap. So from this, we would expect that if Star Carr awls were, that the snap Star Carr awls were hafted, even for a short time period, they would have some amount of microwear traces to indicate that they were hafted. And as you can see in the bottom image there, after 20 minutes, you get a really lovely, well-developed trace of hafting. So because we don't have hafted traces on the Star Carr awls, we do believe that hafting and bow drill use was unlikely at Star Carr, and therefore hypothesis 2 appears to be more relevant to Nab Head, which has a smaller awl size and something that would lend itself more readily to being hafted, more practical for use. Whereas the Star Carr awls that are larger don't need to be hafted to be used effectively. And as Andy said, with the freehand method, they work really well. And this will also tie in well with the microwear trace that we're finding. And so from hypothesis 3, this was where we were looking at snapping that's unrelated to use, potentially linked to intentionality. We applied the SEM, so scanning electron microscopy. So we first looked at experimental awls that we had broken from or snapped by using a hammerstone for impact and break the awl in half. And then we also used, we did it by hand as well from ventral to dorsal aspects. So as you can see in the top image, the hammerstone impact snap has a very jagged topography, which we believe is likely to come from the heavy impact of the hammerstone travelling through the crystalline structure of tool. Whereas by contrast, the hand snap has a very smooth topography with a smooth snap edge and a slight lip on the profile. So from these images, experimentally, these techniques of snapping could be differentiated. But as always, we would like to test this on a larger scale on further awls to see if this variability does sort of hold true at further quantities. And then comparing the experimental snapping with the archaeological snaps that we see on under SEM, you can see here that the topography and the surface texture does appear to be more similar with the hand snapping rather than the jagged topography of hammerstone. So from this, we believe that it is most likely that the awls from Star Carr were potentially snapped by hand for an intentional purpose, based on the SEM images and based on our discussions about the lack of half-uses.
So in summary then, we think maybe hypothesis 2 could better fit the Nab Head signature, a more functional signature with smaller tools that were probably necessarily hafted with the bore drill configuration, used perhaps on a range of different materials, and then because of the forces involved in that rapid spinning and downwards force, you naturally get some breakage unintentionally because of that. Star Carr, on the other hand, by virtue of that lack of hafting trace on the one hand, and the larger tool that doesn't necessitate a bore drill haft necessarily, we think the types of snapping we're seeing, although they look similar, could be from a different source. In this case, perhaps something more intentional, and perhaps something to do with maybe more intentional decommissioning of those tools, for example. In future, we'd love to start to look at this in more detail with something like geometric morphometrics to look at those snaps and see if we can take detailed measurements of them to really understand any key differences. We've described those for you in our results so far based on our observations. We really want to see if GMM can fully characterize for us how those snaps look and create some landmarks that we can compare and contrast with. We'll also expand our method with more contact materials, with larger samples, and with a larger series of snapping in particular to fully expand our results.
Thank you so much for listening, and we welcome any questions that you might have.